Got some excellent experts here to hopefully talk through the myriad issues, economics, political, constitutional, and in terms of business as well. I've got George Buckley, who's the UK Chief Economist at Deutsche Bank. I've got Vernon Bogdanor, who is a research professor for the Institute for Contemporary British History. I've got Christopher Kinsella, who's been a finance director at Victim Support. He was also the chief executive of the Chartered Management Institute. And there's a familiar face on the end, Stephen Herring from the IOD, who's going to be talking about some of the tax implications and obviously business elements from the referendum. Now, I don't even know where to start, so I will start with you, George, and say, since Thursday, we've seen sterling slump to its lowest level in more than 30 years. We had £1.5 trillion wiped off global share prices on Friday alone, and a credit rating downgrade from Standard & Poor's. What's your reaction to all of that in terms of the UK economy?
Well, we put a piece out at 10 o'clock, 10:01 on Thursday night, which explored two avenues. One if we stayed in, one if we were to leave. And the leave story is one where investment is weaker, where GDP softens very significantly, where we see a substantial weakening in the rate of growth of the economy, one where the currency falls very sharply, which of course it has done, and one where inflation rises. And of course, higher inflation is no good for consumer spending. Consumer spending is worth, two-thirds of the economy. So it's not a particularly encouraging environment. And when you read S&P's statement from last night, where they downgraded the UK by 2 notches, there is nothing in that statement which sounds positive at all, apart from the fact that we have monetary and exchange rate flexibility. So in sum, I don't think this is a very encouraging situation. We have a full-blown political crisis. I've never seen the likes of this in my time.
I was just about to ask you if there were any economic positives, but it doesn't sound like there are.
Eventually there might be. The fact that sterling's falling will be very helpful potentially for exports, but in the near term the first thing it's going to do is to raise inflation, which will mean weakening consumer spending, investment spending is going to be softer. I really just don't see many positives at all.
Okay, actually, I should have asked this at the start. So I don't know if George has been a very pessimistic economist, or how does the actual audience feel? If I get a show of hands, how many here actually think that the UK leaving will positively impact their business? No one. How many people think it will negatively impact their business? So, everyone. Okay, so I don't know how we're going to find some positives. Stephen, do you see any positives at all from Brexit? Can we weather this storm? And how do you see the economy and business itself coming out the other side?
Well, we're just setting the scene first. We have surveyed our members on it, and it broke about 60-40 in favour of Remain to leave. Interestingly, I'm going to describe them as the disruptive sectors of the business rather than the established, or the word the disruptive sector uses the legacy parts of the economy. I'm not too sure, I think it's a bit harsh. Were more favourable towards leave, much more favourable towards leave. So I have a feeling that the consequences, whatever it is now, is it 72 hours or whatever, 96 hours after, will be very considerably less than the first reactions are, because we had our parliament reception last night, and I went round and spoke to a lot of members, and they all felt that it was going to be, there was a risk to business. And when I then did a supplementary question, so what about your plans then? Oh no, we've got some great opportunities actually, we're not going to be part of that. And it seems to be that when you speak to people, it's less dramatic. Now, the downgrading, just for example, it's a great newspaper headline, Sterling, UK fiscal position downgraded. I think going from AAA to AA, is it 0.008%, was still one of the strongest covenants on our debt is viewed. Now, that's an initial reaction. I just think that if this conference were being held 3 months from now and 6 months from now, the downside would appear considerably less than they do now.
Well, if our commercial partners are up for it, we can hold another 1 in 3 and then 6. But, George, just going on, obviously Stephen's slightly more positive reading. George Osborne came out, I think it was yesterday, and said that the UK economy, he's fixed the roof, and now it is pouring with rain, but he said it is ready to weather the shocks. And he said the fundamentals are strong. What's your reading of that, George? And then on to you, Vernon.
Well, I think the UK economy has been strong. We've seen stronger economic growth than in the European Union. We've seen employment which has been stronger, unemployment which has been lower. We have a rate of unemployment which looks very similar to that of the US, just around 5%. That doesn't mean to say it's going to be strong in the future. If we leave the European Union, there will be a lot of downside risk yet to come. And to be honest, no one knows. I saw the Bank of England made a list of all of the surveys or reports which have been done which looked at the impact of EU membership on the UK economy over the past 40 years. The range of estimates went from -5%, which was clearly the UKIP study, all the way up to +20%, so a 25% range. 25% of GDP is somewhere in the region of 450 billion sterling. If you can't work out to the nearest 450 billion sterling what the impact of EU membership has been, goodness knows how difficult it's going to be to work out what the impact of a departure is, especially when we do not know what the terms of that departure will be. So we're all guessing here what the impact of this might be on growth.
Bernard?
Well, perhaps I ought to preface my remarks by saying that I did in fact vote Remain, but as George has said, economics is not an exact science like physics or medicine. It's a matter of judgments, and it seems to be the first thing to notice from the outcome is that there hasn't been a panic. There is to be no emergency budget, which we were threatened with. It appears there's not going to be the threat to pensions, the triple lock on pensions, which we were threatened with, and certainly not until perhaps the autumn, any increases in income tax. We are panicked with the threat of a further Scottish referendum, but I think that is also very unlikely because of the falling price of oil and the fact that if Scotland wished to enter the European Union, she'd probably be required to join the euro, and her budget deficit is way beyond the Maastricht criteria of 3% of GDP. It's nearer 15%, and I think rising. So I think there'd be a majority against independence that would be larger than in 2014, and I think the SNP are aware of that. I think the consequences of Brexit depend on whether we can make the most of our new position, which depends on free trade and open markets. And the falling pound will act as a cushion to our difficulties, and if we have austerity, that's one good way of achieving it, rather than through increases in taxation or further cuts in public expenditure. It's better to achieve it, in my view, through raising the price of imports. Freedom from the common agricultural policy will eventually give us cheaper food imports from outside the European Union and a more effective way of subsidising our farmers. We are leaving protected markets in the European Union, and that must be an economic gain which we must put against the likely economic loss of losing passporting rights and access to the internal market. And I think our future economics depends on what we do ourselves, and not so much on the trade deals or other relationships that we secure. It's commonly said the economy has improved in Britain the last 30 or 40 years. That isn't due so much to the European Union as to various reforms, particularly labour market reforms. And the key reforms we now need are reforms in our lamentable skills record, which has nothing to do with the European Union. There was a very good report recently by the House of Lords Ad Hoc Committee on Social Mobility, comparing how much we spend on those going to university with how little we spend on those taking other routes. And I think we ought to look at that, and further education in particular. It's worth perhaps pointing out the Scottish Government, to pay for its free university fees, has cut further education drastically, which is very damaging. And I think we could look even further at Lord Baker's ideas of community technology colleges, people who don't wish to take an academic route at the age of 14. And one tremendous benefit, I think, we could get rid of wasteful prestige projects as a result of leaving the European Union. In my view, HS2 ought to be the first to go. We can't now afford 50 billion on a prestige project whose main aim is to improve the egos of leading politicians, but has very little, as far as I've seen from the analyses, any economic benefits at all. So I think the panic and pessimism is overdone. I say that as a Remain voter. We will survive as we survived when we left the ERM, when there were the same prophecies of doom, and again the falling pound cushioned us. And I think we're not in such a terrible situation as some people are suggesting.
But in terms of prestige projects, I just wondered whether we're going to get a Boris's Fantasy Island now. But that's a different point. Chris, can I just get your kind of initial reaction then? You know, Vernon said obviously no one's panicked. Our speakers from BMW and O2 earlier said neither had they. They are European headquartered businesses. But what was your initial reaction as an FD? Did you go into panic, and what were your kind of initial thoughts, please?
I think I'm speaking really for a lot of people in this room. I'm a serial, lifelong finance director and chief financial officer. And in that particular genre, I've seen every circumstance and turbulence, good and bad. And this one hit me in the same way as the 9/11 events did at the time, that there was no possibility of keeping to a budget, knowing how to make a forecast, and not knowing if the initial reaction was overdone or not. There was no way of calibrating that. And I feel for a lot of us in this room, we're perhaps in the same place. Now, I recognize that all businesses are different. It depends on the sector, depends on your dependency on the EU, your internationalism, a lot of other things. So no one size fits all. But I certainly feel, having seen as many things as I have, that the initial reaction is certainly overdone. What I think a number of us should have done, and I guess didn't do, was to have immediate contingency plans in the event of both outcomes. And I think potentially we are seeing this reaction because largely we were not prepared for this particular outcome, and our contingency plans need to kick in. We need to separate the short term from the medium term. Short term is all about protecting our risks, I think. The longer term is really all about planning for our futures in a very, very uncertain world at the moment. But I'm speaking for businesses here and not straying into the regulatory or economic or political aspects of this, and I can take questions on that later.
Chris, it's interesting you said, no one had planned for both outcomes, and that's business. Vernon, has government planned for the outcome? Does anyone know what to do? Because I wondered why Boris Johnson looked grimmer in victory than David Cameron did in defeat.
I haven't the faintest idea what contingency plans governments have made, but the procedure is fairly simple. The Article 50 procedure requires the British government to seek an exit agreement from the European Union. That is not the same as a trade agreement. The EU can't sign a trade agreement with the country which is still a member, though it can have informal discussions with Britain while she's a member. But the exit agreement covers technical matters primarily of the rights of British citizens in the EU, the rights of EU citizens in Britain, education agreements, reciprocal rights in healthcare, and so on. They don't cover a trade agreement. And it's the difficulty is the Brexiteers aren't agreed on what sort of relationship they want with the European Union. I think someone suggested they had more positions than the Kama Sutra. But in my personal view, the verdict to the voters, with which I disagree, but the verdict to the voters is they want EU immigration controlled, and therefore I think that precludes a Norwegian or Swiss type agreement, and I think it therefore also precludes full access to the internal market and passporting rights, which is what many, certainly of the Conservative Party Brexiteers, would like to see, and the free market economists who support it. So I think we will have a much looser arrangement, either a Canadian type arrangement with a trade agreement, which doesn't cover services, or the relationship I think would probably be the best one, a WTO agreement, a WTO rules rather, with Britain applying unilateral free trade. But that's up to the Brexiteers to decide, and the ball is in their court. They have won. The government doesn't agree with them. There'll be a new government, maybe a new parliament. We may have an election. But the views of Parliament and government, their advice has been rejected. It's now for the Brexiteers to decide their future course and what they want to achieve. So, in a way, the civil service has to wait for them to make up their minds.
Okay, and is the civil service, strong enough, big enough to renegotiate trade on such a massive scale, do you think?
Well, if we have trade agreements, of course, our government hasn't been involved in trade agreements on its own since we joined the European Union, so they will have to get consultants and experts. I think one undoubted conclusion is what always happens in these crises, there'll be a lot of benefit for lawyers and consultants and people of that sort, whatever we decide to do. But I'm sure the civil service will be able to cope with the problems.
Okay. Now, George Osborne and David Cameron have obviously said, Article 50 won't be triggered, at least until the Conservative leadership is arranged. I just wonder what the panel's thoughts on how long that process should or could take. Maybe beginning with you, George, how do you think the markets are reacting to the length of time this could take, and also the government and the main political parties' paralysis, what impact that's had as well.
Well, there's a range of different estimates. I mean, we heard from Jeremy Hunt suggesting that it might take a little bit longer than other candidates for the Conservative leadership. Other people would like it done more quickly. I suppose one argument is that any new Prime Minister, any new leader of the Conservative Party, it's in their interest to do it quickly on one count, because, of course, that means they're going to get the negotiations done more quickly. So when it comes around to the next election, people might maybe not have forgotten, but certainly might have put it to the back of their minds that we had this big renegotiation. So I think there's some, and also investment. I mean, investment, the big enemy of investment is uncertainty, and the last thing you want to do is drag this out for a very long period of time. On the other hand, of course, as soon as we invoke Article 50, we lose the bargaining power that we have. But that said, Angela Merkel, who I think has been quite reasonable in her statements so far since Thursday night, Friday morning, has said that there will be no negotiation ahead of Article 50 being triggered. So that does suggest that we can't really do much until we have triggered that Article 50. Jeremy Hunt also talked about the possibility of asking the electorate what they think of the final deal, which I think is really quite important, because I can't see what the point of leaving the European Union in favour of the European Economic Area, the Norwegian deal, is, because politically at least, we are in exactly the same boat as we were, but we voted out for two reasons: immigration and sovereignty, and both of those issues have not gone away if we accept the EEA.
Okay. Now, with uncertainty, it's a word that keeps coming up. Stephen, to go to you, I just wondered, how have your members reacted to the uncertainty that has now gripped the markets, and what do you think their kind of response is to this in going out in the longer term?
Well, it's something that we've had a lot of discussions with them, and we've polled them sort of regularly on this. And you know, we've had people in for breakfast and discussions and what have you, a good selection of our membership. Now, I think there is a, broadly speaking, pro-Remain position. Having said that, I think it is incredibly soft. And most of it is about the quite genuine and very understandable concerns that somehow the UK gets blocked or has to face some heavy tariff on goods and services to enter the existing EU market. So if that is dealt with on a satisfactory basis and the necessary compromises are made, I think our members will very quickly become more positive. They were saying that they were going to recruit more people, and have, when some of the other forecasts were saying employment growth was going to fall. And I think there is amongst the core of our membership of medium-sized companies, neither the smallest businesses tend to join the FSB, and I suppose the largest lobby through the CBI often. Our members tend to be in that middle bracket. And I think they're pretty innovative and have a glass half full view of things. Now, on the leadership of the parties and Jeremy Hunt, I confidently predict the Conservative ballot won't be between Nicky Morgan and Jeremy Hunt. It will be, my guess, I like Andrew Leadsom myself, but my guess is it will be between Boris and Theresa May. And I don't think either of those two have what one would describe as extreme, anti-free trade, anti-European viewpoints. In fact, I think quite the contrary. Of course, Theresa May was suspected of having Brexit sympathies, but opted for Remain. And Boris, nothing in his record as the Mayor of London suggests he's not in favour of a liberal, open economy. So I think that now, as to the length of time it will take, I'm absolutely sure that the Remain side are completely right. These things to sign the eventual agreements will take ages and ages and ages. But my feeling is that the guts of those agreements will be made pretty damn quickly, because European companies will put pressure on their governments, like UK companies will put pressure on its government to say that, look, we've just got to try and bring the amount of uncertainty down as fast as we can. Now, no doubt the lesser spotted haddock, which is fished off the North Sea oil platforms. I've made it up, don't check it. That might only be agreed in 2019, but I think the really big matters will be dealt with considerably sooner, and business confidence will then return fairly rapidly, in my view.
Okay, thank you. And Chris, as somebody in business, you know, when I look at some of the, you know, kind of maybe is the doom mongering, project fear reaction of spending plans on hold, people moving their operations outside the UK, redundancies, and you are seeing some of these actions already. Is that the kind of action you'd expect business to take? Is that
Yes.
what things it is? Do you want to elaborate on what kind of things businesses will be considering, or should be considering?
Uncertainty is certainly the enemy, we all know that. And during this negotiation period, that uncertainty will only increase the problem that I see it. Opportunities will be pursued, but not with the same alacrity as would have been the case last month. That's pretty clear. We'll see investment decisions being put on hold. That's an excuse, but it will happen. I think hiring of people will become a serious issue. We'll see a seizing up of professionals in terms of those who normally would have moved around in the marketplace, which is not good for the economy. But beyond that, there are opportunities that will be put on hold in the mergers, acquisitions, joint ventures, collaborations area. And what I think might turn out to be a consequence of that, and I know this sounds very negative, is that some of the organisations outside of this precious country will take advantage of those situations to our longer-term detriment. We can't measure that. It's unknowable at this stage. All of it sounds very, very negative. I accept that, and I actually am a half-full glass person. So I really do think there are opportunities that will be pursued, but I think on balance it will be negative, caused by this uncertainty at a business level.
If anyone does need a stiff drink after all of this, we do have a bar at the end of the day. So George mentioned earlier, Vernon, obviously about, you know, the campaign's been fought on immigration, the free movement of labour and access to the single market. I just wondered how dependent the UK's ability to address these factors is on staying within the single market. How realistic is that, given the free movement of labour and the two things that are interlinked, and given what an integral part of the campaign it was? I just wondered how you see constitutionally that whole thing playing out.
Well, I think the problems for the city will be more serious than those for manufacturing industry, the services in general and financial services. And I think that's the access to the internal market is a more serious problem than the comparatively low general EU external tariff. But after all, the city is adaptable, has been adaptable in the past, and will have to adapt to the new conditions. And it's fair to say that the experience of the last 30 or 40 years has shown how dynamic and adaptable markets are in Britain and in America, less so for the EU, which is much more of a protected market. And, you know, if one talks about uncertainty, uncertainty is inseparable from democracy. Bound to be radical changes if you live in a democratic system. The only way to get certainty is to have an authoritarian system or a dictatorship. As for the future government of the country, I think the personality of the next Prime Minister matters less than the fact of what he represents, namely the need to carry out the wishes of the British public in the referendum. And I think that will benefit the Brexit wing of the Conservative Party, which is, broadly speaking, the right wing of the Conservative Party that believes in free markets. And in a sense, it's the revenge of Margaret Thatcher from beyond the grave, because we'll be moving towards, I think, a more Thatcherite sort of policy. And if there is a general election, which is possible, I would expect that wing of the Conservative Party to gain very considerably at the expense of the Remain wing. I'd expect UKIP to gain a few seats. And the Labour Party, I say this sadly, but I think the Labour Party could be smashed as it was in 1931, because it's so very out of touch with so many of its supporters, its working class supporters in particular. Liberal Democrats could make small gains amongst those who don't like the result and would like to see it reversed, but I think what you might call the Thatcherite wing of the Conservative Party will benefit. And it's a paradox, given that many of those who voted Brexit were strongly for leave. And it's worth perhaps pointing out, given some of the comments in the press, that it is the elderly and the poor who turned out in largest quantities. People in Camden, and Camden is seeking to reverse the result, Camden had one of the lowest turnouts in the country. And the young who are complaining about the outcome voted in very small numbers. 43% of the 18 to 24-year-olds voted, 58% of those under 30 voted. The average turnout was 72%, which indicates a very high turnout amongst the elderly, and the turnout was higher than in a general election, higher than in most recent general elections. There was a clear decision with the British people and a 7% majority in England for Brexit, much higher than the overall majority for Brexit. So the only way to overturn the results is to reverse what we did in the 19th century and deprive the poor or those without university degrees of a vote. But I don't think that's actually going to happen, so I think we have to stick with it.
Okay. To move it back onto to economics, we wondered earlier whether the government has a plan. Well, Mark Carney did appear to have one, and I thought when he came out, it looked like almost he'd been on the Valiant piece. He was so calm and relaxed. But he was able to calm jittery markets by claiming the banks are in better shape to weather the crisis, and there was an extra 250 billion available to shore up the system. So, George, I just want your assessment of that, and then get an idea of what the bank should be doing in the longer term.
Well, I think of all the people who are talking about the economy, he came out as probably most presidential. He sort of walked along this long corridor up to the podium, spoke, and then we watched him as he disappeared down the corridor. And he had an air of gravitas, and it did make the markets a little bit more confident that the Bank of England would do something. And I think they will. I don't think the bank will do anything as soon as the July meeting, which is in a couple of weeks' time. But by the time of the August meeting, every quarter the Bank of England provides forecasts, makes new forecasts for economic growth, for inflation, for unemployment, and they will be doing that again at the August meeting. And I think that will be a time when they can reflect on what's happened, what is likely to happen in terms of economic growth and inflation. And I think they will look at that and say, we need to ease policy. And at that point, we wouldn't be surprised if they cut interest rates. Now, they've already said that they don't want to do anything too aggressive too quickly. So I suspect what they will do is cut interest rates by a quarter point. It will have very little impact on the economy. And then a month or 2 months down the line, they might look at what's happened with the surveys coming out a lot weaker, with evidence starting to show that we are seeing weaker economic growth, and decide that they need to do more. Now, if they need to do more, there is very little they can do when it comes to interest rates, because at that point, we will be a quarter point above zero. Now, assuming that they don't want to go into negative territory, they don't want to cut rates below zero, then what they will do is maybe take another 10, 15 basis points off. But that's not going to be enough. So I suspect that they will have to restart the quantitative easing program, assuming that the data does come in as weak as we think it will. So I wouldn't be surprised if, and this is the whole point which S&P pointed out yesterday, which was that we do have a lot of monetary and exchange rate flexibility, so we can do something to offset some of the weakness that we will see in the data.
Okay, so you don't think there's a chance of going into negative interest rates? It's not that situation?
Well, there's certainly a chance, but the bank has made it very clear that they don't really want to go down that route. I mean, after all, the reason why the ECB has gone into negative interest rates is because it wants to lower rates to make that differential large enough to push the exchange rate down. I don't think we will have any worries about a low exchange rate over the next few years. And we've already seen that the exchange rate has lost 20 big figures against the dollar. It's down from 151 down to 132. So it's a very sizable fall, which they don't need to worry about exchange rate weakness.
Thank you. Stephen, I know we've just had our fill of tax prior to this session, but I did get you on board for this panel because there are some tax implications that the audience of CFO should be aware of. I just wondered if you'd outline what the tax implications are for business following this vote.
Well, we've seen, I'm one of the older people in this room, indeed, on this panel. When, of course, we joined the European Economic Community as was, I just started working in tax at that time, and I was old enough in the first referendum to vote the wrong way. And at that time, the EU was about the VAT system, and it had many merits, in my view, that saying that you really don't want firstly, it's not a pyramid tax. In other words, it's paid by it's not a layer tax on a tax or a tax supply. And also, it means that you have a similar system in the sort of geographic area, which makes considerable sense, especially if you're in continental Europe, I guess. So no one was really, I mean, it was much more complex. I mean, I think when the Chancellor introduced it, he said VAT is a simple tax. No one has said that since. Now, but the big difference we've seen is through the freedom of establishment and freedom of movement articles, where more and more taxes have been brought within the auspices of the European Union. Now, I think that one of the advantages of the UK establishing a looser relationship is that some of those, like how we deal with our corporation tax, at the moment, HM Treasury, believe me, are worried about the enterprise investment scheme for investment in very small businesses, which is being attacked as state aid. Now, you know, I mean, I voted leave, you know. So it's my challenge would be, why doesn't the EU focus on the sort of multinational companies and leave the SMEs in Italy and Greece and Portugal and the UK to get themselves going? So I think we will see a drawing back on some of the extent and the reach of tax legislation across Europe. And I think that will be good for the UK, but also good for continental European countries, many of which I think agree with the UK that it has gone too far. We spoke about the BEPS programme, that there's gold plating going on to the BEPS proposals in Europe to a very high degree, that North America and many of the Asia-Pacific region, South Asia, won't go along with. So we don't need this gold plating. So I think there's good news for continental Europe and the UK in tax.
Well, thank you for that positive note. I would end on that, but I have one question left before I pass it over. Vernon, I just wondered, so what kind of happens next? So what do you expect to happen to the huge corpus of EU law? What will happen to things already transposed into the UK? And those things that are obviously currently moving between the two. Will we get the bonfire of red tape that all small and even large businesses might hope for?
Well, this will occupy Parliament for some time to come, perhaps longer than 2 years. But the first obvious step is to incorporate, oddly enough, all EU secondary legislation into our own legislative system, because we need to consider what we'd like to keep. People would no doubt like to keep some EU laws, for example, rights in the workplace and so on. It's up to Parliament, no doubt, to modify others and abolish the rest. I can't actually see a bonfire of regulation. We're already much less deeply regulated than most of the EU member states, except for the Netherlands. And it's true some members in the financial community would like to see much more financial deregulation, but I doubted that would be popular with the British people. So I don't think we'll see a bonfire of regulations. We'll see an adaptation to British conditions. But that will take a long time, and it's obviously for Parliament to consider. And you may think it's a good thing they'll have to consider that, because it'll prevent them getting up to any other legislative mischief while they're doing it. So that would take about 2 years or perhaps more. It's a long and difficult technical process.
Okay, thank you. Before I move on, obviously, to our final speaker, who's going to be even a more authoritative speaker on this subject, does the audience have any questions they want to put specifically to our panel members? Yes, over David, over there. Thank you.
Could I ask the panel as to what their views are about the period of uncertainty that we're looking for? And I suppose the way I would look at it at the moment, but you will have different views, is 2 years to negotiate the leave, a period to leave, and once we've left, probably a period before things settle down when we get used to being on it. So are we looking at a transition, a total transitional period of 10 years or 3 years? What's the overall view? And I accept it's a guess.
Anyone want to take that first?
I think the biggest uncertainty is how to answer that question, because it's unknowable. Speaking parochially from a business perspective, as I say, any uncertainty is the enemy here. And although Section 50 might get invoked early in this cycle, it will simply lead to a lot of work for people that will distract. An example is the law firms and the accountancy firms, I think, who will be doing a great deal of this work, but not necessarily finding it satisfying and being distracted from a better service level to the rest of the economy. So the uncertainty, in my view, could stretch for a very, very long time. And I think it's important for businesses with long-term business cycles in terms of their order intake, delivery cycles, investment cycles, that the uncertainty today, maybe it's 3 months before the change of government and so on. If it's a short-term uncertainty, it may lead to long-term consequences that are avoidable. So I think you need to look at it in a longer-term consequence of the short-term uncertainty as well. That's my view.
Okay, well,
I would guess that we would leave the EU by the spring of 2019, before the next direct elections for the European Parliament and choice of a new European Commission. As for trade negotiations, if we have them, they could take longer. But just to warn again against the sort of some of the panicky reactions, that they were there in 1992 when we left the ERM. And a more extreme example from my historical knowledge in 1931, when Britain was forced off the gold standard, and the previous Labour government had been asked, they asked the then Chancellor, Philip Snowden, what would happen if we were forced off the gold standard. And he threw his hands up in the air and he said, the deluge, millions unemployed. In fact, the British economy recovered when we left the gold standard. And we had although the 30s are often thought of as the hungry 30s, our rate of growth was high in the 1930s. There was a house building boom, and the British economy did extremely well, and unemployment reached a peak shortly afterwards and then fell moderately, rapidly. So I think we shouldn't panic about this and worry too much about the uncertainty. The future of the British economy depends on what happens in this country, and as I said earlier, particularly on whether we can grapple with this very long-term problem we've had of poor skills, and that's in our hands and not in the hands of anyone in any other country.
Yes, I mean, if you Google, other search engines are available, of course, but if you Google joining the euro, or not joining, UK not joining the euro, and you look for the articles on the consequences of that, well, many of there were some dire predictions about how, you know, London was going to lose masses of its business to Paris and to Frankfurt, etc. Very, very few, if any of them, came to pass. And, you know, a grey market in the euro famously was first created in London before it was in any of the euro area. So I think that we have no need to sort of fix on one particular date, because I think it's more a process of where you zero in on the final few things with each iteration where there is radical disagreement. And I think there'll be, once the politicians get sort of back off and they take advice from businesses in all of the countries, you'll find that there's a will for businesses to reach these agreements quickly, and the politicians will fall into line with that. And there'll be very few things left by 2019 that are still unresolved.
Okay.
There's only one precedent in the past for any country having left, or part of a country having left, the European Union or European Economic Community as it was then, and that was Greenland. It's the only country that's ever voted out. And that took 3 years to negotiate out, and that was before Article 50. They voted out in February 1982, and it took them pretty much till 1985 to do so. Now, bear in mind that the UK is a much larger economy. Of course, Greenland was a much larger country in geography terms, but I think the EU at the time said they'd lost 1/3 of their surface area. But economically speaking, the UK is much larger. It's got more political links after the 5 major treaties that have been signed from Europe since 1986. We've got greater financial linkages. We have much greater trade linkages. I imagine it will take a substantial length of time to negotiate out, but I think that all parties, there is an incentive for all parties to get it done as quick as possible.
Okay, well, thank you for some sobering, but some positive thoughts in there too. Now, I'll bring the panel debate to an end, because I know we're going to go into Brexit too. This time it gets personal in our final keynote. of the day. But it just leaves me to thank my panel, George, Vernon, Chris and Stephen. Thank you very much.